Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 47 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today's episode is quite a bit different than any of my previous episodes. That's because this week marks 1 year since I began this podcast. I wanted to do a retrospective episode for all of you, since many of you have been here with me right from the start. This episode does not feature a story about a famous spy. Instead, it's the story of Spycraft 101. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to me, why I started it, ups and downs of starting a business, and what's in store for the future. One thing you may have realized if you've been following my accounts or listening to my podcast for a long time is that I don't really talk about myself at all. And that's because I want to keep the focus on the stories themselves and not try to insert myself into history. Nothing that I've done or experienced myself holds a candle to anything that I talk about here. So I just use these platforms to shine a light on some incredible history that has been overlooked or mostly forgotten as time goes by. And not only that, but I don't really consider myself or try to portray myself as some kind of expert in these topics. Instead, I try to go out and find the real experts and ask them questions for the benefit of myself and for the listeners, of course. And the way that I look at it is I've been doing these accounts for about 2 years now, and 2 years is the normal amount of time that it takes a person in the United States to get an associate's degree. So nobody who studied for 2 years in community college comes out with an associate's degree and calls themselves an expert, unless they're a huge narcissist, and I am not. So I just want to say that this is very much a work in progress, and that's why I typically kind of stick back in the background, because I want to let the real experts and the real stories kind of take the spotlight. So this episode is probably the only time you'll ever hear me talking about myself. But before we get too far into this episode, I want to let you all know about a new educational tool you're not going to want to miss. It's the Gray Man Briefing Classified. By now, I think I know my listeners pretty well, and take it from me, this briefing is exactly the news and educational reference source that you've been looking for. You'll get breaking news updates from all over the world on topics including planned protests and riots, low-intensity conflicts, natural disaster alerts, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, and more. You'll also get access to articles that help you build your own skills, including urban survival, home security, counter-surveillance, escape and evasion techniques, and more. And this is much more than just a newsletter in your inbox. Joining the Gray Man Briefing Classified also includes invitation-only channels on the Telegram and Signal apps for convenient real-time updates. The newsletter subscription is normally $5 per month, but if you use the code GBC Spycraft, you can save 20% each month for the life of your subscription. I'm already a member myself and have been reading and learning a lot since I first subscribed. Look it up yourselves at graymanbriefing.com. That's gray with an A, graymanbriefing.com. And use the discount code GBC Spycraft to save 20% right from the start. This episode right now is debuting on May 23rd, 2022. If you follow me on Instagram, and I think that most of you do at this point, you can scroll all the way back to my very first post and you'll see that it was posted on May 24th, 2020. Fast forward 1 year and my first 2 podcast episodes debuted on May 24th, 2021. Now here we are on episode number 47 after 1 year. So late May is kind of a big anniversary week for me these days. But the idea of Spycraft 101 goes back to early 2016. I first came up with a name over 6 years ago now, and I originally just envisioned it as an ebook series only. I initially wanted to focus more on building the skills used in espionage, with each book devoted to a different skill. First book was going to be about developing your elicitation skills. In case you don't already know, elicitation could be described as the art of guided conversation, where you engage with another person and draw out some targeted information without them ever realizing you were trying to learn about that in the first place. That's an incredibly useful skill in a wide variety of settings and walks of life, which is why I chose to start writing about it several years ago. I first created a draft ebook, which was around 20,000 words in length, and I had several other topics planned to write about, but At the time, that was as far as I got. I wanted to write a second book on situational awareness while traveling, and a third book on hiding things in plain sight, for example. But I did not make it that far back in 2016. Not only did life events eventually get in the way of me pursuing publication, but I also realized that although I'd put a lot of effort into it, it wasn't exactly what I wanted to devote myself to. For one thing, there's already a lot of great books out there on developing interpersonal skills, and plenty of books on how to think or act like a spy. So I didn't think I was really doing anything drastically different from many other very qualified and knowledgeable authors out there. For another thing, my interest in this subject really leans more towards research and storytelling, as I'm sure you can see now. I've got an associate's and a bachelor's and part of a master's degree, and all three of those are in history. So the result was that the draft of that original ebook that I wrote just sort of collected dust for a few years while I moved on to other things. But then in spring of 2020, just like so many other people, I found myself sitting at home with not a whole lot to do. After a few weeks of gardening and cleaning out the garage and all of that stuff, I decided to revisit the project that had been in the back of my mind this whole time. This time, I decided to start from scratch and keep the name Spycraft 101, but go in a different direction. The plan was still to publish a book series, but instead of how-to guides, this would be a collection of my favorite true stories. So first, of course, I started an Instagram account to generate some interest in the material, and I hired a graphic designer to come up with a logo. When I first started, I only had maybe 24 or so stories fleshed out, and I had a few dozen more that I kind of vaguely knew and that I would need to read up on. So I posted teaser versions of these stories to Instagram, and then I would do chapter-length write-ups of these stories for my book. And somehow the Instagram account really took off almost immediately. I really had no idea what to expect, but after just a few posts, they started getting shared around pretty quickly. One thing I want to make clear is that up until May of 2020, I had zero experience or education in starting or running a business. Like I said earlier, my degrees were in history, and my work experience had all been either military or government. The interest in history is great for research and creating content, but I didn't really know the first thing about growing an audience or converting them into customers or creating products that people wanted to buy, et cetera, et cetera. And I also didn't know how to share content that could turn into a money-generating enterprise. And that is what this is for me. It is a money-generating enterprise. It's a side hustle. It's a business. Luckily for me, as you all found my account one way or another, you liked it enough to share it around, and it just kept growing and growing. So for a few months there, I was averaging about 100 new followers a day, which was just incredible. I was also working really hard, reading lots of books, and spending, I would say, at least 2 hours a day researching and writing and editing, all to keep up that tempo that I had initially started with at least one post a day. About 2 months after I started on Instagram, I launched the first version of my website in early August 2020, spycraft101.com. Looking back now, it was very bare bones, but I had to start somewhere. I think I had maybe 8 long blog posts published on day one, plus a few products, including my challenge coin, in the Shopify store that I also created. I did a big announcement post on Instagram, and at this point I had made $0, of course, with the Instagram account because there was no way to spend money with me. But by the end of that first day, with the website open and the Shopify store open, I had generated over $300 in sales. And that just completely blew my mind in a way that is very hard to describe, and it's certainly not something that I'll ever forget. It felt like I had really launched a successful online business with no experience and no training or anything, just figuring it out one day at a time. Of course, that's not the culminating event. It was just the start. And a successful launch, in my mind, doesn't mean that I was going to be making $300 every single day from there on out. But I kept plugging away, and by the end of 2020, I'd made about $5,000 in gross sales through the website. Definitely not life-changing money, and actually that's a pretty small amount if you consider the number of hours that I'd been putting into the project since May. For the first year, in fact, none of the money that I was earning was really turning into cash in my pocket. It all went towards more books for research, more designs for products, more inventory for sales, web development fees, all that sort of thing. But still, I felt like I was building a decent foundation for this business. Another thing I want to point out is that when I just summarize it all in a minute or two like this, it sounds straightforward, but straightforward is the very last thing that it was. I knew nothing about web design, but I had to build a WordPress site and a Shopify site from scratch. It was hours and hours of watching YouTube videos, how to do all this stuff. Everything was kind of cobbled together with duct tape and rubber bands in the early days, but I still managed to fulfill orders and bring people to the site. Sometimes the website would just go down for no apparent reason, and I'd have to go to the hosting platform, and then I'd be Googling what is a DNS server and why isn't it responding, or something like that. And an hour or two later, I would have learned something new and gotten the site back up. And then the next day, some other new problem would reveal itself and I'd do it all over again. Even today, I spend at least as much time on technical issues as I do just researching stories to share. And don't even get me started on figuring out business accounting on the fly when all I'd ever done for my taxes in the past was file a 1040. So about 10 months after I started the Instagram page and 8 months after launching the website, I was up over 25,000 followers and considering how I should branch out next. That's when a friend who I've known for years since we were in college together pitched me on starting a podcast. I'd already been thinking of exactly that, but I didn't really know where to start. I'd been interviewed only once before on the Gutter Fighting Secrets YouTube channel, but all I had to do then was call in on Skype and answer some questions. There was no planning or editing involved or anything like that on my end. So while I knew a podcast might be a great next step, I'd been putting off taking that first step since I didn't know what the first step should be. Luckily, this friend of mine was now working as the director of strategy for Daydreamer Studios, a media company based in Denver, Colorado. We talked over the phone a couple of times, and although I was pretty nervous about moving into a brand new medium when I'd been writing and in print only, I also realized that this was exactly the push that I needed, and it was time to take the leap. I reached out to a couple of my contacts on Instagram for my first 2 episodes. That's Andrew Joseph Blasco was my very first guest, and he's the author of a book series on Fritz Duquesne, one of the most amazing human beings of the 20th century, in my opinion. Andrew was on board to record an episode immediately. Then I messaged Doug Pattison, a former CIA case officer who you might know as @TexasSpyDad on Instagram. He's done a lot of interviews in the past, so I felt good knowing I could rely on him to carry the episode. That was just my second interview, and it's still one of the most popular episodes of all, even a year later. But after those first 2 episodes, I'd already run out of personal contacts who I knew would make for a good episode, so I had to start cold messaging strangers. And that was intimidating to me, not because I was nervous about talking to someone, but because I really had nothing to offer them in exchange for their time yet. I didn't have a built-in podcast audience, so there was no guarantee that anything would come of it for them. I've also heard that cold messaging someone with an interview invitation has an incredibly low rate of success for most podcast hosts. My very first cold approach was an absolute moonshot, in my opinion, and I still can't believe that it actually worked. I found Michael Sellers online and I sent him a message. He said yes and became my guest for episode number 3. That is still one of my all-time best episodes, in my opinion. If you haven't listened to it yet, go back and check it out right after this. Michael was arrested in Moscow in 1986 on his way to meet a source and was paraded in front of cameras before being kicked out of the country a few days later. He went on to serve in the Philippines and after that had a successful career in Hollywood. And his whole story is just incredible, and you can hear it here if you want to. So when Michael agreed to the interview, that was my first real inkling that this podcast might be something big. And I've been incredibly fortunate that I've had a really good run of amazing guests since then. Some of the biggest names and most fascinating people in this niche have said yes to my interview requests. As the podcast started developing steam, I was able to build off of some of those early successes by name dropping whenever I did my pitch, which establishes a little bit of credibility. Now, after a year, I've interviewed 2 Pulitzer Prize winning reporters, 2 Air America pilots, 2 former CIA case officers, a history professor from Harvard University, a KGB agent, a defector from the Soviet embassy, a senior FBI counterintelligence special agent, and many other very distinguished guests, including lots of authors and historians. Because it's such a small world, some of my guests have recommended me to others, which has led to more interviews. Even so, only about 50% of the people that I reach out to end up coming on the podcast. Many of them I never hear back from at all. I've only received 1 flat rejection so far, And that was when I tried to reach an author through their publisher and was told that that person no longer does any interviews. Not too long ago, another author told me that his appearance fee was $400. So unfortunately, I don't think we'll be hearing from him, as I can't invest that amount of money in a single episode quite yet. But maybe one day in the future, because he has quite an amazing story to tell himself. At the moment, I've got a list of around 40 potential guests and interviews for the future. Some of these are people I've already reached out to but never heard back from, so I'm going to keep plugging away. Others I can't get a hold of, but I'm still searching for their contact information. And the rest are people who've written a book, and I just have to finish reading it and then schedule the interview. And we have some really good interviews lined up. I'm not sure how long I'll be able to keep recording and publishing this podcast, but hopefully I can keep bringing in these amazing guests for years to come. There's one thing I did right from the start, and I think it's been a major contributing factor to my success so far. I put a lot of time into preparing for each episode, and I draft up an outline and a questioning plan in advance. Normally, my outlines are about 2 pages long, and I ask my guests for input, especially on their biographies, because, of course, they want the details of their personal history just right. Most of my guests have written books, so in those cases, I always read their book in advance before I talk to them. That's an 8-hour or a 10-hour commitment each week, usually, but it also means that I'm not going into these interviews blind. In fact, for the vast majority of the questions that I ask once we begin recording, I already know the answer because I've already done so much prep work beforehand. One of the fun ways for me that I've been memorializing my progress is that I'm slowly filling up my bookshelves with books that I've read by authors that I'm on a first-name basis with. And I've got about 2 shelves full right now with me, and I've got some spare space on a third shelf that is filling up quickly as well as I get more and more people on the podcast. If you're wondering about podcasting equipment, the only hardware I've purchased so far is an ATR 2100X microphone by Audio-Technica. I mount it on the desktop tripod that is included with it in the purchase, and I haven't bought a boom arm yet like so many people get for podcasting. I also don't even use headphones right now while recording, so I can't really make a good recommendation on best headphones for podcasting. I've seen a lot of pictures online of these amazing podcasting studios that people set up at home, where they've got the acoustic panels on their walls, and they've got a neon sign with the name of their show in the background and all kinds of stuff, and I don't have any of that at all. I just have a microphone that I set up on my desk 5 minutes before we start the interview. Just plug it in via USB to my computer. Speaking of, all of my interviews are recorded using a service called Riverside FM, and my producer handles the editing and any technical issues that come up during conversations. So I've been very lucky to kind of sidestep a lot of the big barriers to starting a podcast. That has allowed me to focus on finding the best possible guests and preparing for each interview rather than worrying about the technical details in publishing and all of that. Before we go on, I want to take a moment to fill you guys in on the newest tool that I'm wearing and carrying in daily life. It's the Donovan non-metallic knife from Black Triangle. If you aren't familiar with Black Triangle, then you're really missing out. I love these guys because they put the dagger in Cloak and Dagger. If you've been following me for a while now, then you probably already know why Black Triangle has called their newest non-metallic knife the Donovan. It's named after General William Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Under Donovan, the OSS was unconventional, unexpected, and highly effective, just like Black Triangle's tools. The Donovan is manufactured here in the United States. It's made entirely of G10 composite and comes with a thermoplastic sheath and a couple of amazing extras, which you'll have to see for yourself. You can find it at blacktriangle.com. That's blktriangle.com. You can also get 15% off your first order with Black Triangle using the discount code Spycraft101 or by navigating to blacktriangle.com/Spycraft101. I love mine, and I know you're going to love yours as well. I also want to talk about some of the lessons that I've learned over the past couple of years. This is more for anyone out there considering starting an online business or growing their Instagram account or hosting a podcast or anything like that. I don't consider myself an expert in any of those things, and I'm not going to offer a paid course about it like so many people seem to be doing these days, but maybe a few of the lessons that I've had to learn the hard way will save you a lot of time and effort. If I had to go back and start over, the biggest thing that I would do is not put all of my eggs in one basket. Like I said earlier, I started the website several months after the Instagram page, but the website was for a long time a lower priority for me. For one thing, it was much more difficult and time-consuming to learn how to run a WordPress blog than just hitting submit on a social media post. And for another thing, the page views and audience tend to grow a lot more slowly as well. So the website was more of an afterthought for a pretty long period of time, which now I know that that was a mistake on my part. Because the thing to remember about social media is that someone else will always be there to decide if your activity meets their standards or not. And I cannot tell you how many times I've butted my head against the Facebook and Instagram algorithms and gotten nowhere. Like I said earlier, for a while there, I was gaining about 100 new followers a day, which was just incredible. But after change to the algorithm on Instagram, that dropped off to a fraction of what it was. Instagram these days wants to promote reels and video content way more than pictures. So posting a single black and white image from the Cold War, like I tend to do, meant that I was automatically deprioritized in the feed, and only a few of my followers would ever see it in their own feeds while they scroll through. So I kind of scrambled to get around this in various ways, and I tried to put out as much video content as I can, but there just aren't that many instances of videos or events being caught in motion in this niche. So I have a pretty limited pool of videos to draw from, unfortunately. These days, it's very common for me to work for several hours reading, researching, writing, and editing a really fascinating story that I know you guys would love. Then when I post it on Instagram, it's only shown to 8 or 10% of my followers, which means a lot of people just assume that I have stopped posting, and they don't really take the time to manually search for my account. But that's what I get for being so reliant on one of these tech behemoths that doesn't care about my success. So if you're on the verge of starting something similar, lay your foundation elsewhere and use social media for secondary promotions only. Yes, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, those are where the people are, but you can disappear from those sites at any time without warning. So you need to be prepared. And I was a little bit prepared, but not as prepared as I could have been. And my account and my business kind of suffered for it. Nowadays, my website is much more in-depth than a few months ago. I've got dozens of articles up already. Plus, you can find embedded YouTube videos of my podcast episodes. If you're not subscribed or listening through an app, you can go to the YouTube videos on my website. And unlike on my social media pages, I also earn a small amount of money through Google AdSense whenever someone visits my site. So it benefits me to put as much content as I can. You can find it all at spycraft101.com. I continue to add almost every single day something new to the site. If you yourself are wanting to create a website, there are tons of options out there, of course. I went with WordPress for the blog, like most people do. It's hosted on Bluehost, which has been pretty problem-free for me so far, and it's just a few dollars a month. I also have a design suite called Elementor installed on the site, and I found that is pretty easy to edit and publish articles quickly. Like I said, I'm not a web designer. I don't have any background in that, but as a kind of an uninformed and inexperienced person, I found it pretty easy to figure out, pretty intuitive. I'm sure there's also a ton of other useful tools and apps out there, but I'm not using any others at the moment. I also have an email list, and I put out a newsletter to my email list every couple of weeks. That's just to keep people up to date on my most recent articles, and usually I give a quick personal update on what I'm working on or what I'm planning in the near future as well. The newsletter is another way to reach people without going through social media scrutiny, and it's working really well so far, although my list is still pretty small overall. But I've got some ideas to grow it and provide more value as well. If you aren't already subscribed to the newsletter, you can find a link to it in my Instagram bio, and you'll also get a free ebook as well when you sign up. If you're planning an online business and it bears any similarities to mine, just once again, get going on the website and the email list as early as possible. For the email, I use a service called GetResponse, and it's very easy to learn how to publish a newsletter. I figured out the basics within a couple of hours, and now I can put one together in 30 minutes or less in the evenings. But I don't use every single feature that I'm paying for each month, so I still have to make time to learn more about it all. There's other services out there besides GetResponse, like MailChimp, for example, and ConvertKit, I think, but I haven't used any of those, so I can't really speak to their advantages or disadvantages. Another thing I've learned is that I should have focused on one thing and mastered it before I moved on to the next thing. I've been pretty inefficient in dividing up my time by trying to do too many things at once. For example, I've got accounts on LinkedIn and Twitter, but I've barely used either of those in the past other than to make contact with potential guests. They're very useful in that regard, but I could have been growing audiences there the whole time, and instead they're still very small and very low on content, which is something I need to work on. If you're wondering what's in store from Spycraft 101, I still have a lot more stories to tell. My plans for the next couple of years are to continue growing the podcast audience with more great guests and great stories. Published my first 2 books already, and I'm hard at work on the next one right now, which will be called Spy Shots Volume 2. This one will be another 101 true tales, just like Volume 1. I've already written the first 14 or so chapters of this Volume 2, and I hope to have it published and available before Christmas of 2022. I've learned a lot about the editing and publishing process with the first 2 books, which are already out, so it should go faster this time around. After that, I'm planning a book on female spies, saboteurs, and double agents. Then is going to be Spy Shots Volume 3. And then after that is a book still in the planning stages on the many connections between espionage, propaganda, and postage stamps, if you can believe it. If you've already listened to episode number 43 with Dr. Mark Pruitt, then you already know there are some very fascinating stories that have been portrayed or propagandized on postage stamps all over the world. So I want to explore that history a lot more over the next couple of years. On that note, I started another Instagram account recently depicting a lot of these stamps that I'm referring to. You can find it on Instagram as @cold.war.stamps, Cold War stamps. I'll also be posting a lot of these stories to my blog as time allows. I'm still pursuing more partnerships with businesses that are similar to mine. I'm working with 2 right now, which you've already heard from in this episode, and worked with several others in the past as well. If you yourself are a small business owner and you think that we might be able to work together on something, just get in touch with me via email or through my Instagram page, and maybe we can do great things together. I also want to talk to you guys about what your support means to me and how you can help me out. This might go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is no way that I would have put this much effort into telling these stories for the past couple of years without all of the positive feedback that I've received from you. I'm very happy that so many people are diving into their own research after getting just a peek behind the curtain from browsing my page. More than a couple of people have commented that my account is practically the only reason that they still go on Instagram each day. And, that's incredibly gratifying to hear. So I appreciate all of you, and I mean that. If you enjoy the content and you want to know how to help me grow or keep growing, there are a lot of things you can do without even spending any money. First and foremost is just subscribe and tune in to every episode of the podcast. We can track our overall downloads and subscribers using a service called Buzzsprout, and that helps me attract advertisers in the future. If you can take a couple of minutes to leave a written review on whatever platform you're listening on, that's also a big way for me to draw in more listeners. If you have bought one of my books from Amazon, please leave a review there when you have time. Even one sentence makes a big difference, and it helps me put my books in front of more people, plus convince them to purchase it once they're looking at it. Plus, I hope that you've mentioned my podcast in a positive light to someone that you think might enjoy it. My audience numbers are still steadily rising, so I think that many of you have done just that. And if you are willing to spend some dollars, supporting my sponsors via the links and the discount codes that I give out is a huge way to show that you're listening and supporting both of us. I'm sure you've heard a few ads on my podcast by this point, and hopefully you've noticed that I'm partnering up with small businesses that are in a very similar niche to mine. These are not big corporations with big marketing budgets. It's people like you and I. Guys working out of their garages and home offices trying to connect with people any way that they can. They're not paying me huge bucks to talk about them, but hopefully we are each helping the other get the word out about what we have to offer. So every purchase or subscription made after you hear about it on my podcast does make a big, meaningful difference to one of us. And it's not just another dollar into a big corporate fund or something like that. And finally, I want to close out by saying thanks to the people working behind the scenes to make this podcast possible. First is my producer, Jessi Carman, who's recording this episode right now. Jessi is the owner and lead producer of Daydreamer Media Studios. She records all of my episodes. She helps troubleshoot any technical issues that come up during the interviews, and she does all the editing afterwards and publishes them to the podcast platforms and the apps that we're currently on. Jessi also comes up with the titles and the show notes for each episode. Right from the beginning of this project, I've always done all of the content creation myself. Nothing that you read in my book or social media pages was written by anyone other than me. When we first recorded the very first episode last year, I didn't know what I was doing, of course, since it was brand new to me, so I didn't even think about a potential title for the episode. But as soon as I saw that Jessi had titled episode number 1, quote, "The Life and Lies of Fritz Duquesne," unquote, I knew that I'd be in good hands with her. So since then, I hand off pretty much everything podcast related other than finding the guests and actually speaking to them. And it's worked out wonderfully, as I'm sure you can tell. If you have ever wanted to host your own podcast, or you're hosting one right now somewhere else, your first step should be to get in touch with Jessi. If you are thinking about switching over, she and I have a great working relationship, and at this point, I can't imagine anyone else as my producer. Next, I want to thank Madeline Brazil. Madeline is a former college classmate of mine I mentioned earlier who now works as a business consultant. She's been a huge part of my success right from the start. I run ideas past her almost every day to get her feedback, and she has steered me in the right direction time and time again. Everything from graphic design to social media strategies to starting the podcast in the first place. She's been there through all of it, and she's got a great sense for what works and what doesn't. Just as one small example, I was planning to release my book series as ebooks only. I think I mentioned that earlier. But Madeline convinced me that a paperback edition was the way to go. And since then, I've sold probably twice as many physical copies as digital copies. And if I hadn't listened to her, I never would have gone in that direction. If you have a small business of your own, she can help you as well. You can find her on Instagram at Madeline Brazil. That's MadelynneBrazile, Madeline Brazil. Danita Urban has also been a major player in Spycraft 101 this past year. Danita does all of the audiograms for my account, which I post to Instagram and to YouTube. She also edited and published both of my books so far, doing both the print and the Kindle ebook versions and the cover designs as well. She even redesigned Spycraft101.com for me last year and turned it from my own bare bones version into something that was much easier to navigate and much more visually appealing. And last but not least is Andy Pedic. Andy is the original founder of Daydreamer Media Studios, and he was the person who decided to take a chance on me with the podcast in the first place. That was a risk that worked out for everyone because since then, this has become one of the biggest shows in the Daydreamer network in terms of the number of downloads. Andy also hosted his own podcast called The Cast of Pods, which is intended for hosts to learn how to start or improve their own shows. And early on, I listened to every single one of his episodes at least 3 times over the past year and learned a lot about how to run a good show. So if you're considering starting a podcast or if you already have one and you're in the early stages of your journey, you might want to check out Cast of Pods with Andy Pedic for some great advice on how to help your show reach its full potential. Once again, thanks for listening, everyone, and thanks for your support online. It means a lot, and I plan to be here for a long time to come. A year from now, we should be closing in on episode 100, if all goes well, so I will see you then. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram, at Spycraft101 and at cold.war.stamps, or connect with me on Patreon. My patrons get exclusive access to long-form blog posts that dive deep into some of the most amazing stories in the history of espionage and receive free or discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. That includes free PDF copies of my own book, Spy Shots Volume 1, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage, and Covert Arms, Weapons from the World of Spycraft and Espionage. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, including Stephen S. and Keith F. With your support, I've been able to continue funding my research and publication across multiple platforms to date. You can also find more great articles on my website, Spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Thanks for listening to this program brought to you by Daydreamer Network. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. Your feedback allows us to rank on the best new shows list and continue to grow our podcasts in order to bring more unique and talented storytellers to the network. To check out our shows, including programs about relationships, sports, business, nutrition, leisure, and more, head to www.daydreamernetwork.com. We look forward to seeing you back next week for another great episode. Have a wonderful day.